guys, it's Violin Tides. I am making a video here for my Gaming Amory channel in order to help people who might still be kind of up in the air as to what healing class they want to play come Dragonflight. I've watched way too many videos on YouTube about healing classes, even though I don't typically play them. As a person who is a raid leader in a guild, I have eaten up every little ounce of information I could get about every class. And I took some time to talk with a couple of people who played on the beta, both in a raiding setting and also in Mythic Plus testing. And I wanted to compile all the information into tiers for high-end Mythic rating, AOTC and like casual CE rating, and then Mythic Plus. Just as a disclaimer, tiers are a meme. No class is ever going to be properly put in its place in any tier list. So please take these tier lists with a grain of salt. However, I do want to go over some notes that I have. For the sake of making sure that we're not talking about any specific class first, I'm going to be going in alphabetical order. That's this order right here. I have them all in the D tier right now until I actually talk about them, and then I'll place them in an appropriate place. So I'm going to be judging each class in 6 different categories. First one is playability. How easy is it for someone to pick it up and play it, especially as a beginner who's never played the class before? This also is going to include playability in terms of button bloat, how many keybinds you need to play the class effectively, and how difficult it is to maintain the HOTS or whatever different buffs they need to have active all the time. The second category is utility. How many buffs and debuffs they bring, things like BOP, PI, Lust, actual buffs like the Powered Fortitude, Mark of the Wild, raid cooldowns for the specific raid rankings, etc., etc. Third category is throughput. So overall HPS and absorbs, how well they can react to the bursty incoming damage, and things like of that nature. The fourth category is damage. How much damage do they bring to whatever content they're doing? In a raiding environment, damage is really not that important, but it is nice to know that you have either good damage or bad damage to fall back on when there's really not much to heal at certain portions of the fight. Next category is fun. Are they fun to play? Is it rewarding to heal with? Do you feel like you're getting a good amount in terms of the investment you put in? So, for example, a discipline priest puts in a ton of time and effort into making sure that they are getting good cooldowns off and having really good raptures and evangelism and everything like that. Is it rewarding? The last category is just overall. Just considering all the different variables from the other categories we talked about, where do they end up ranking in the long run? Now, I do want to say that I am not planning on ranking these in each category with a tier. I am instead planning on ranking these in each category with a number. 1 out of 5 means that it's terrible in that category, and a 5 out of 5 means it is chef's kiss perfection in that category. So, let's get started. Alright, so the first class we're going to talk about is Resto Druid. Where are Resto Druids? That's a great question. Resto Druids for playability, I'm going to say they're about a 4 out of 5. there used to be two different playstyles in Shadowlands. There was the Adaptive Swarm playstyle with Necrolord, and there was the Convoke playstyle with Night Fae. And depending on what content you were doing would depend on which spec you would play. Now that in Dragonflight, Resto Druids have both Adaptive Swarm and Convoke the Spirits, it's a great low effort playstyle for beginners. Affinities are no longer a thing. You can just talent into whatever damaging abilities you want to do, whether it's Cat or Moonkin. They're fairly easy to heal on. They've got some proactive healing with pre-hots, but they're quite good at reacting to incoming damage, assuming you had your hots on them initially. Swift Mend is a pretty great oh no button. In terms of button bloat, I wouldn't say there's a lot of button bloat, since if you have the button, it's because you're going to use that button rather than you have to take it in order to get to something else on the talent tree. But there are quite a few keybinds that I would think are very important to have. There's a lot of healing buttons in your rotation, but overall, the sort of core number of healing buttons are really not that many. It's pretty easy to pick up, so I would rank their playability at a 4 out of 5. The next category is utility. Resto Druids have so much utility. I wrote down every single spell for each of these healing classes in order to give myself a better idea of how to rank them for utility in terms of what they bring to a key or a raiding environment. And Druids are the king. Druids and Holy Paladins are absolutely reigning supreme in utility. They they never need to stand still in order to cast like many healers, and they are able to easily pick up an interrupt on a short cooldown. Mark of the Wild is the best buff any healer can bring to a key because it brings damage healing and DR. And as you get higher into keys and higher into mythic rating, people tend to want more verse, as shown by the Vantis rune system that we used to have. So it's basically like everybody having a Vantis rune as you get into the high end rating with Mark of the Wilds. So for utility, I'd rank them a 5 out of 5. Throughput, there's really not a lot to say here. They were essentially kings of throughput in Shadowlands, and that has not changed. They have only gotten better since Shadowlands, with basically having double covenant abilities now. Um, so there's really not a lot to comment on here. They're the throughput masters with how much healing they do. So 5 out of 5. Now let's talk about damage. The availability of their different forms that buff their damaging spells and availability to keep up dots without having to go into forms. Also, blanketing people with hots and then being able to focus on damage until more damage comes in is extremely valuable. I would say their damage is very similar to Discipline Priest or Holy Paladin or Mistweaver Monk, even Preservation Evokers, who are currently the king of damage. But we'll get there. um, Resto Druid is honestly super fun to play with damage, and a lot of the damage that they can do when there's no healing to do during raids has really short cooldowns. Like let's say there's no healing to do for a while, I can go into cat form and convoke, or moonkin form to boombox and convoke. If I'm just looking for a little bit of extra damage, maybe to help with an ad or something in a raid, or obviously in Mythic Plus, you're going to be trying to do damage. I would rank them a 4.3 out of 5 for damage. In terms of fun, it's really hard to beat a Resto Druid for fun. Swarm and Convoke used to be two different builds. Combining both of them just makes them so much stronger. Catweaving and Boomboxing both feel fun and satisfying to play, and they don't really have a lot of that struggle that some healers do, where big damage comes in and you just have all this anxiety happening because you're trying to heal people up. Blanketing hots and then just going back to whatever you were doing is pretty typical. If you have to, you can regrowth spam. You've got plenty of cooldowns to handle any oh shit moments. And I think that even if you have a minor knowledge of most raid and dungeon situations, they're extremely fun. Even people who aren't healers might not even realize how much fun they are until you pick it up and try it. And again, with how easy it is to do, I recommend everybody try it. I would say it's a 4.7 out of 5 for fun. It's very close to the top. Overall, I would rank them 4.8 out of 5. If I'm going to put them somewhere on this meme of a tier, I would put them S tier. They're not quite perfect, but they're like a solid S. They're definitely going to continue to reign supreme in keys and raids, just like they have in Shadowlands. Not to mention the stamina buff they recently gave to everyone across the board when factoring in their HOTS. Basically, the only thing I would say that resto druids are missing is a lust for Mythic Plus or some DR cooldowns. Obviously, they have Iron Bark, but aside from that, having something like a Diva Aura will be really valuable, but not that they need it. They're still great without it. All of the really tough Mythic Plus fights feel like they were made for resto druids. And honestly, cat weaving and boomboxing is fun. It's helpful, but it's absolutely unnecessary. The bulk of their damage comes from Sunfire and Moonfire and DPS intellect trinkets. Considering how strong Mark of the Wild is, it's almost as good as having a PI in the group because you get damage and DR and healing from that verse percent. And due to their strong HPS throughput and casting on the move, using your CDs frequently, lots of mobility and utility. They're just so solid. You're always going to want one. And in a raiding environment, I can imagine taking two of them because they're just going to be so good. All right, let's talk about evokers. Let's talk about their playability first. There is very few buttons on this class. It might seem a little overwhelming at first since they're a brand new class, but just spending about 10 or 15 minutes looking through the specialization and reading the spells is pretty easy for a beginner to pick up and understand. However, there is a fair amount of button bloat when it comes to their utility, which there is a lot of utility in this class, but I would still rank them really high even with as many buttons as their utility specifically brings, because their core healing spells are very, very few. I'd say maybe 4. So playability, I would give them a 4.5 out of 5. Let's talk about utility. I would say they have a couple of different things that they bring to the table. They bring a lust. They have the potential to bring Zephyr, which is like a stampeding roar. They have multiple knockback abilities. They have an ability that increases the duration of their group's crowd controls. They have a paralysis like spell called Sleepwalk on a very short cooldown. They also have the Rescue, which is similar to Leap of Faith. And they have a lot of other cooldowns that raid leaders can schedule in raids. Decent group heals, like a resto druid, but way burstier in terms of damage. So I'd say for utility specifically, because they do have an interrupt they can spec into, but it's a long cooldown interrupt, and because they don't really have a lot that they bring to the table in a Mythic Plus specifically, I would rank them a little bit lower for utility. You're still going to want them. This is not me saying that they're F tier. But compared to what a resto druid or a disciplined priest or a holy pally bring in terms of specifically utility, I'm going to have to give them a 3.5 out of 5. Let's talk about their throughput. Time dilation is about a third of their healing. It's essentially giving someone a stagger on a 1 minute cooldown, and that bumps their throughput through the roof. They have absorbs, hots, bursty heals, minor group heals. Their throughput is through the roof, honestly. The only class that I think beats Evokers in throughput is Resto Druid, which we already talked about. Maybe Mistweaver Monks, but we'll talk about them when we get there. In terms of actual healing done, I would have to rank them a 4.6 out of 5. Let's talk about that crazy evoker damage. Their damage potential is extremely high in Mythic Plus. I mean, even in raids, not that we really care that much about their damage in raids, they are just the kings of damage right now. They have a great damage rotation. It feels very smooth. It's very fun to play. Their throughput being a 4.6 out of 5, their damage 5 out of 5. And ranking them for fun, there's no comparison. 5 out of 5. you're you're a dragon. Of course it's fun. You can fly. You can double jump glide. You can rescue people. You can do a cool breath. There's really no situation that you don't have an answer to, and that's what makes them so much fun. On top of the fact that they're a brand new class. Finally, my overall ranking for evokers, they have really good throughput at lots of relatively low cooldowns, similar to Resto Druid. They have lots of CC availability, as well as an Interrupt and a Lust. They're going to be valuable in raids, even more valuable in Mythic Plus. The only drawback I'd say is you're unlikely to ever want more than one. You definitely want one, but probably never more than one. Overall, I'd give them a 4.6 out of 5. They're not the perfect class, but they're pretty close. All right, let's talk about Holy Paladins. Playability, I would say, aside from Discipline Priests, they are probably the hardest healer to play in the game right now. When it comes to the development of Dragonflight and the beta, it feels like they were working really hard to give Paladin class tree a lot of love, and then they just forgot to finish it. As a beginner to the Holy Paladin class, you're going to find them extremely hard to pick up, especially because they're kind of having this identity crisis between the melee healer and the ranged healer. As a Paladin main myself, I can attest to the fact that their class talent tree is an absolute mess. They have so much utility, but they are going to sacrifice either DPS or HPS in order to get those utility things. And to have to sacrifice things to be useful does not feel good. So if you're a beginner and you're like, oh, I'm going to take these things that give me healing, why would I take the other stuff? You might not have an interrupt. You might not have bop. You might not have a dispel. Like there's so many things that you could potentially not have that it definitely puts a big drawback on their playability. I would also say that because the tree has a lot of things you want to have in a Raider Mythic Plus, that leads to them having problems with button bloat. They've got way too many things to keybind, way too many buttons that you're hitting frequently enough that you need to have keybound. In terms of like the things you have to take versus the things you want to have, it's so strange to have this problem of we have too many buttons, but also we feel like we're missing buttons. So, unfortunately, Holy Paladin for playability gets a 2.9 out of 5. Holy Paladin's utility is a completely different story from their playability. If you imagine who are the most useful people in a raid for cooldowns, there's not many more classes that can compete with Holy Paladin for utility. On top of the fact that they already had Aura Mastery and Diva Aura and the Maraud's build and, all this other stuff, they also gave them a battle res, which does have a drawback because it costs holy power. Why? And Blessing of Summer, which in and of itself is basically on the level with PI. So Holy Paladin utility has just gotten so much better, almost to the point where they have too much, I might say. But if we're talking about a class's utility compared to the other class's utility, Holy Paladin gets a 5 out of 5, no question. The next category about Holy Paladin I want to talk about is throughput. Now, Holy Paladin is really good with reactive healing. Wings is a very strong healing cooldown. The Maraud's build is still very good. They struggle a bit in dungeons, but not as much as some others. Resto Shaman. They're not where they were in season 3 and 4 of Shadowlands, where nobody wanted them in keys, but they're also not where they were at the beginning of Shadowlands, where everyone wanted them. So their throughput is like very solidly in the middle. I'm not sure if that's a good place for them or an awful place. That's up to you to decide, but I would put them a 3.9 out of 5 for throughput. Holy Paladin damage is pretty good right now, especially since you have to do damage to really heal effectively, but it's not nearly as good as other classes that heal. I would say if you're going to bring a Holy Paladin to a key, you could probably get away with a Preservation Evoker or a Resto Druid instead. But yeah, that's just my opinion. They're competitive in terms of damage against any other healers, but without Ashen Hollow, they're really struggling. I would rank them probably a 3.9 out of 5 for damage. In terms of fun, it can be a fun class to play with. It does feel rewarding to hit certain buttons like Divine Toll, but the fun factor drops dramatically when you think about just how slow and immobile they are. They're basically just utility monkeys. They aren't as exciting as some other classes out there, but they absolutely can be amazing, amazing people to have in any Mythic Plus or raid in the right hands. Because of that, I would say probably 4 out of 5. It's time to rank Holy Paladins overall. I have to tell you, Holy Paladins feel like, even though they're in this really weird place that some parts of them are amazing and some parts of them are awful, I would probably put them somewhere in the A. I would say their utility bumps them up over a lot of classes, but they are gated behind how hard of a class it is to play well. They're having this weird identity crisis between melee healer and caster that I feel like puts them in a awkward situation. They struggle to keep up in terms of HPS and mobility versus a lot of other classes, but their niche of sustained tank healing and high utility on paladins in general is always strong. Depending on how your tanks are at taking care of themselves in raids and Mythic Plus, Devo Aura and the many builds they can play, they're a pretty solid addition to any healing team. The Maraud's build is a great, oh shit, raiding build to help people who get hit with a hard burst. And in Mythic Plus, they won't be as strong as Evokers or Druids for healing, but their utility plus that new battle res could be enough to bring them to medium keys. I just don't see them getting in the much higher keys. They are a super fun class to play. It can be stressful. I find myself relying heavily on wings when I'm healing on them in the beta. If I don't get procs, it feels like there's nothing I can do, and I'm way more reliant on cooldowns than other healers. But they're not trash, so I would say 4.2 out of 5 overall. Hey, so most people tend to only watch a lot of videos for maybe a minute or two before they decide if they like it. If you've gotten this far into the video, I'm guessing you probably like this content, so I would really appreciate if you could hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing to do this, and maybe just leave a comment and let me know what you think I should improve on going forward. Sorry to interrupt. Back to the lists. Discipline Priest. Discipline Priest, whew, they are, for playability, easily the hardest class for anybody to pick up. They don't have a lot of blood and bloat. They're just extremely complex. In order to execute their healing rotation properly with reactive and proactive heals, um, discipline can't exist without a DPS rotation. It's just not possible. So the DPS rotation adds more things that you need to keybind. And knowing when to DPS and when to heal, you can argue you can get away without DPSing as a holy pally, but you cannot argue that with a disciplined priest. I would never say that disciplined priests are, you know, awful for any particular category. It's just a completely different game over any other healing class. You have to master it in order to play it well. There really is no okay disciplined priests. You're either doing awful or you're doing amazing. So unfortunately, playability, they got to be a 2 out of 5. Utility at first glance doesn't seem like they bring a lot. Their class tree is a little strange in terms of wanting to pick up utility and also wanting to pick up the things that you need to be an effective discipline priest. They have a lot available to them, and the DR that they bring, as well as the healing that they bring, they're very mobile now with Angelic Feather, and you really can't argue with PI. Twin of the Sun Priestess is taken by every single priest now, pretty sure. I don't know much about Shadow Priest, but in terms of utility for rating, they're easily a 5 out of 5. In terms of Mythic Plus utility, they're closer to like a 4 out of 5. So I'm going to bump them up to an overall utility of 4.7 out of 5. Discipline Priest throughput is really hard to measure. If we're talking about an exceptional player on this character, 5 out of 5. No contest. Doesn't matter what you're doing, Mythic Plus or rating. A master of this class easily can make this class nerf every other healer in your raid just because of how much damage they prevent. However, given how hard it is to set that up and perform properly, and how heavily you get punished if you do it wrong, and the amount of fight knowledge you're going to have to execute it well, it's probably closer to a 4 out of 5 in raid. In Mythic Plus, they have done some changes to make Discipline Priest easy to heal better in smaller environments, like the buffs to the penance and the other penance talents. But some fights in dungeons, Discipline Priests are just going to struggle a lot, especially the higher the keys get. So I think in Mythic Plus, they're probably going to be closer to like a 3 out of 5. It's going to be really hard to justify taking a Discipline Priest in high keys. So overall, I'd put their throughput at a 4 out of 5. Damage, Discipline Priests have always been the kings of damage in a healing class. They definitely have some competition with Preservation Evoker now, but since the way that they heal is mostly through damage, it's hard to say they're not high on damage. They are probably the highest they've ever been right now. If you're great at Discipline Priest before, I'd say you're going to continue to soar on the damage meters for healers. I would say there's probably 3 or 4 classes that are competitive with damage right now, and this is one of them. So, ranking their damage, I would put them at a 4.5 out of 5. Let's talk about playing Discipline Priest and how fun it is. If you like Discipline Priest, they are super fun to play. There's massive bubbles that you can put out right now, and you get Angelic Feather, which was previously only a holy talent. They require a lot more fight knowledge than any other healing class in the game. They require a ton of setup. Again, mistiming anything can really screw you for the rest of the fight or dungeon if you're in a Mythic Plus. So the anxiety that they induce can be very strong for some people, which can drop their fun a bit. So comparing them to others, they might not be as fun as other classes. They're not awful. They're just not as exciting. So I would probably rank them average in terms of fun. If you're great at it, you're going to continue to have fun with it. So I'd say 3.5 out of 5. Let's give them a final ranking, shall we? Again, I'm not a big fan of the tiers, but let's talk about numbers. They're at a decent place compared to where they were in Season 3 and 4 of Shadowlands because there are a lot of other classes that bring so much more to the table. It's going to be hard to justify having one in most setups. That being said, Race to World First is most likely going to have one because they are extremely good in raids. I would say they're a very hard to master class, but if you can master them, they are irreplaceable. If you don't put in a lot of time and effort to be amazing, you're going to fall flat on your face. So, because they are very difficult to play, I'm going to put them as a 3.9 out of 5. So I would put them high B, low A. Let's talk about Holy Priests. The playability on Holy Priests is through the roof, I would say. It is a fantastic healer for a beginner. If you have never played a Holy Priest before, it is going to be very simple to pick it up. There's definitely a lot more active abilities going from Shadowlands to Dragonflight, so you will find some keybinding bloat that'll be annoying, but otherwise it's a fine healer. It is easily the easiest healing class to pick up in the entire game. Even if you've never healed a day in your life, you can pick up a Holy Priest and do 20s, you know. Their core healing spells are easy to understand and pretty easy to be competitive with even without min-maxing anything, so I would put their playability at a 4.5 out of 5. Let's talk Holy Priest utility. They have almost as many buttons in terms of utility that Discipline Priests have. They're one of the few healing classes that don't have a kick, so that does drop them quite a bit in terms of utility ranking for Mythic Plus. Utility for raiding, I'd say they're probably a 4.5 out of 5. They've got a lot of things that buff other people, such as the Divine Hymn, the PIs, Hymn of Hope, things like that. But in terms of Mythic Plus, they're probably closer to a 3.5 or 4 out of 5. So I'm going to put their utility at a generous 4.3 out of 5. In terms of throughput, they've been the king of throughput for so long, but they no longer reign supreme. They'll be fine in raid environments, but I think Growl put it best when he said, the best thing about playing a Holy Priest is that you have the ability to play Discipline. There's so many people who play Holy as a one-trick, but being able to pick up Discipline Priest and be decent at it makes you far more valuable in a raid and Mythic Plus both. It's very mediocre in throughput. There might be one per team if they're hurting for a fort buff or PI from elsewhere, but they're unlikely to be in high-end rating or Mythic Pluses. Why bring a Holy Priest when you can bring an Evoker or resto druid? There's not much argument if you have a choice between two amazing players. You'd pick the non-Holy Priest first. So, throughput, they're dead center. 3 out of 5. For damage, they pump pretty hard in the pre-patch, but the only healer I think they might beat or be on par with in Dragonflight is resto Shamans, who are hurting pretty badly right now themselves, but we'll get to that. They were given Mind Games instead of the carrying ability, which was the one thing that allowed them to pump hard in Shadowlands. Mind Games sucks. There's no nice way to say it. Holy Fire is meh. Their damage is just in the toilet at the moment. So, unfortunately, for damage, they get a 2 out of 5. For fun, again, this is a subjective category. They are consistent, so you won't see high bursts like you used to. They are rewarding because you don't have to know what you're doing so much of the time in terms of the different dungeons. And it's extremely simple. It's like the Warlock's Reign of Fire or the Beast Mastery Hunter of Healers. You press buttons, receive heals. Very straightforward, not so high on the fun. So I'd say they're average. 3 out of 5. Overall, the king of healing people doing stupid things, they have great answers to big damage taken. They don't have a lot of setup required like some other classes. I think it's solid, so there will likely be representation overall, but I can't imagine they're going to compete in high end Mythic Plus keys or high end rating over other healers very often. So overall, I'm going to have to put them as a 3 out of 5, which lands them solidly in the B tier. Now let's talk Mistweaver Monk. In terms of playability, I think beginners are going to really enjoy the playstyle. It's fairly easy to play, but it is very hard to master. It can be difficult to get into the DPS to heal mindset, similar to Holy Pally, but damage to heal isn't as crucial for Mistweaver Monks. It's just a nice side benefit versus Discipline Priests and Holy Pallies who really have to DPS in order to heal effectively. Maybe 30 to 40% of the healing they do is through damage. They've got a lot of healing spells, and Renewing Mist is one of the last smart heals in the game. It's based on range, absorb shields, all sorts of stuff that no other healing spell in the game considers. Due to the DPS aspect, the healing playstyle can be intimidating to pick up, but once you really sit down and try, it's fairly easy to figure out. There's a lot of buttons, so there's a lot of keybinds, but they're not nearly as button bloated as some other classes. They're not super beginner friendly like Holy Priests, but they're also not as scary as Discipline Priests. So I'm going to put them on the level of 4 out of 5. In terms of utility, they bring a couple of things that are very important, such as Ring of Peace and Paralysis, a very short cooldown interrupt, and the Monk debuff. However, in terms of raids, they're very underwhelming. Cocoon and Revival are really their only big things. Chi is a fun button to hit, but it's not quite as large as, let's say, Devo Aura or a really well placed Convoke or Tree or even a great Preservation Evoker hitting all their cooldowns. Because their utility is fairly low in raids, but their utility is really high in keys, I'm going to have to put them at a 4.4 out of 5. In terms of throughput, talking about Dragonflight at max level with decent gear, I'd say they're probably beating a lot of classes like Holy Paladins, for example, but they're not likely to beat classes like a Resto Druid or Preservation Evoker. They require a bit more setup than other classes to obtain that much throughput, but they have a capacity for high throughput in the hands of a master. They don't have any DRs, but as a pure throughput class, they do bring a lot to the table. So, in terms of ranking them for throughput, I would put them at a 4.2 out of 5. For damage, Failing Stomp, in addition to their other usual damaging abilities, helps bring Mistweaver Monk back up in terms of doing damage along with the other healers in the game. They're not going to crank like a Preservation Evoker, but I would say they're probably tied with Holy Pallies and Disc Priests in terms of damage done. White Tiger's statue is going to be extremely strong at max level, and they only have a few damaging abilities, but the ones that they do have are very decent. So I'll give them a 4 out of 5. Fun. Again, this is subjective, but I think it is a super fun spec to play. It's very fast paced. It's just about managing hots and doing damage, and you have the ability to heal while out of melee better now than before. But their healing cooldowns are pretty lackluster, so that does detract a small amount from the fun. The balance to that is that the Celestials are super fun. The mobility is extremely fun. Their class fantasy is exciting. And their class overall isn't so intricate that you're going to be overwhelmed by everything. It is a class that can be brilliant in the right hands, but even a beginner can have fun with the class without feeling exactly sure of what buttons to push at what point in time. Because of that, I would rank their fun a 4 out of 5. Finally, overall rankings. They're fine, they're not bad, and they're also not the kings of healers. There might be some representation in the Race to World First. Um, I'm not going to be surprised if they're there, but I will be surprised if they're not, if that makes sense. Their throughput is extremely good, which bumps them up over the okay classes a little bit. They're in a fine place, and I feel like they're relatively well balanced in a good set of hands compared to some classes who really need more love than them. So, even with the nerf to their tier set in Dragonflight, it's still incredibly good, and they deserve to be, I'd say, like a low A. So, I would say 3.9 out of 5. Finally, Resto Shamans. Resto Shamans, for playability, there are so many things you can take that it can feel overwhelming with how many things you need to keybind. They are hard to master, but easy to play. It's easier than HPAL, but definitely harder than Holy Priest, Evoker, Resto Druid. I would say in terms of playability, they're similar to Mistweaver Monk. So I would put them at a 3.8 out of 5. Let's talk Shaman utility. They are going to be hard to beat for anybody. I honestly can't imagine anybody that has more utility spells between all of their CC, the fact that they bring an Earth Ellie that can tank temporarily in case your tank dies in a Mythic Plus key, the fact that they have so many raid cooldowns, it's impossible to argue with them being a 5 out of 5 for utility. The only thing I would say is that they don't bring everything, but they can bring anything. So I'm going to put them at a 4.8 out of 5. Shaman throughput is where things start to go downhill. Spirit Link Totem is technically a heal. Healing Rain is decent. Chain Heal is okay. But their overall throughput is not great, specifically compared to other healers. It's really rough to the point where if you bring a Resto Shaman in your Mythic Plus and your Resto Shaman is not a super high end player, you will likely struggle. They really need off healers to survive and fill in the gaps. It's like they were designed to be a raid healer. In a Mythic Plus, their cooldowns are going to have to be micromanaged, which creates a lot of problems when it comes to their overall throughput. However, as I said, in a raid environment, their kit is basically designed for it. So because they are amazing in raids and meh in Mythic Plus, that's going to drop their ranking a bit for me. So throughput, I would say they're fine. 3 out of 5. Let's talk about shaman damage. It's the worst right now. It's a race to the bottom against holy priests here. They can do damage, but it's never exciting or fun or rewarding. Chain Harvest from Venthyr would have been so nice to keep going into Dragonflight, or even Vesper Totem from Kyrians, but they didn't opt for that, and as a result, Shaman damage suffers tremendously. So I'm going to have to rank their damage a 2 out of 5. Let's get to the subjective fun category, shall we? Similar to Discipline Priests, you need an extremely in-depth knowledge of fights in order to set up things like Cloudburst and when to pop cooldowns, because they really do have a lot. It's pretty anxiety-inducing if people are dropping quickly if you don't have Spirit Link Totem available, and if you haven't previously set up your totems to answer those problems preemptively. Earth Ellie and Splink Totem are the few oh shit buttons they have for good reactions to problems, but it's rarely fun to play this class when you have so many other slightly more fun options. So I wouldn't say that they're not ever fun to play, but I also would say I probably wouldn't seek them out after having played them for a bit. So I'm going to rank their fun a 3 out of 5. It's time to overall rank resto shamans. Their talent tree is so good. It's so well made. There is not a better class tree. There is almost too much utility choices when it comes to Mythic Plus keys. There might be representation in World First just due to their massive utility in raids and how their kit really seems to be built around raids, but we'll see. Losing their big DPS Covenant abilities makes them fall from grace a bit more than others, but they have a very strong burst HPS with the cooldowns such as Splink and Ascendance. And although they are able to move while casting with Spirit Walker's Grace, they are very immobile. They're basically a totem themselves. Don't move and spam spells. Because their cooldowns are pretty long in cooldown, that does drop them a bit for me. Chamois damage is okay in single target and small AoE packs, but the big packs, since their damage is capped, makes them look pretty awful. They really need a lot of loves from the devs that I think they're unlikely to get, so I'd put them at like a 2.8 out of 5. I'd say they're probably slightly below Holy Priests. And this is my final ranking for all PvE content. I know that tiers are a meme. I'm not a big fan of tiers, and that is why I try to use numbers in order to rank everything in the long run. I think that for world first race rating, we are most likely to see these top three here: Resto Druid, Preservation Evoker, and Holy Pally, with maybe a Discipline Priest thrown in there. It really depends on the group. And for rating that is not world first, just AOTC or cutting edge guilds, I think it's going to be harder to find an exceptionally good Discipline Priest. So I think they would probably drop a bit in ranking for me based on that. So I would probably put Resto Druid, Preservation Evoker, and Holy Pally kind of near the top, and drop everything else to be basically equal in B tier from there. My final tier for Mythic Plus would be Druid and Evoker at the top, with Holy Paladin and Mistweaver Monk not too far behind. Holy Priest is fine in a Mythic Plus, and Discipline Priest and Resto Shaman are also fine in a Mythic Plus. So if we're talking just about Mythic Plus, this would probably be my ranking. That's it. I know this is a long video already, so I really appreciate everybody who stuck it out. Make sure you hit the like button and subscribe button so we can know if this is the kind of content you want. And I will see you guys in the raid.